a lovely time for me in the early years of my career. And I met a lot of really good people here. So it's been actually nice this weekend to be here and revisit a number of my old stomping grounds and some of my older friends. And yes, I have moved up to Manchester, which is a big bustling metropolis, but certainly very different from the more visually attractive, I might say, Cheltenham. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is really the fruit of research that has been going on in my life for many, many years. And finally, I formulated into a book, which came out last year. I'll show you this slide in a moment. And I've been presenting this material in different formats to lots of people all around the country, either to academic audiences or more popular audiences. And there's some interesting ideas that emerge out of studying primarily French. So the book is about four French guys who are the second sons or the younger brothers of kings. But I thought it might be interesting to talk tonight about a bit broader. So I will start off by talking about my French. I'll only talk about three of them, rather than moving into the 18th century and talk about the fourth. And then I will do a bit of comparative thoughts, keep it kind of open and broad. I won't go into a lot of details. Looking at Prussia and of course England, because that's something that people are often a lot more familiar with. And we'll stay mostly within the 17th century, which is the century that I am most at home in. But some of the questions that start to emerge, and if you think about what is an overall point, I guess, of my book and of what I want to talk about tonight, is how monarchy, the history of monarchy anywhere, whether it was France or Spain or Great Britain, went through a period of centralization in the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, where little by little by little, brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, all kind of got cut off. In the Middle Ages, monarchy had been much more of a broad family affair, where the king was always at the head of the corporation, you might call it, but the other members felt enabled or empowered to participate in government. By the time of the 17th century, and you've probably heard the word absolutism before, you have one monarch, one government, one decision. So what do you do with your brothers or your cousins? And that's kind of where this research came from. So I'm going to present two French princes who didn't do very well and spent most of their lives in rebellion against their brothers. And then I'm going to focus on the third one, who's really the one that I know about the most, who is Louis XIV's younger brother, Philippe. So I'll introduce these three guys to you. And what Philippe did was really sort of said, if I can't be politically powerful, I'll do something else. So the main theme that I'm going to talk about is what else did he do? And so we're going to look at patronage of art, of buildings, of architecture. I think this is something that people often like to grab onto. And so I've tried to make it as diverse as possible. So if you know something about literature, you might see a name you recognize. If you know something about music, you might see a composer you recognize, although probably not. I don't think that Etienne Moulinić is particularly famous, although maybe he should be. So that's where I'll start. And then I'll do a bit of comparisons to see how this happened in other monarchies that were also centralizing. And I'll look at two case studies, first in Prussia, and then finally in England is where I'll end up. And look at where, I always want to say second sons, but I need to be a little bit careful because some of them weren't second sons. They were actually third or fourth, but so younger brothers is a better way of saying it. Okay, so that's where I'll begin. And I start with a slide called The Party at the Palais Royal. And if you know Paris at all, this is right across the street from the Louvre. It's still there. It's currently the seat of the French Parliament. So you can't really visit it, unfortunately. But the bits behind it are a grand open park, which you may have seen if you've explored that area of Paris between the Louvre and the Opera. That's kind of where the Palais Royal is. But why I'm showing this here is because this is where Louis XIV's younger brother, Philippe, lived for most of his time when he was in town. Louis XIV famously hated Paris, never wanted to go into the city, and therefore he kind of left it open to his brother to dominate. And if you know anything about the court of Versailles, perhaps you've seen the TV show, it's party, 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 sex, sex, sex. But the truth is, by the time Louis XIV got to middle age, he changed his personality entirely, and he married a second secret wife, his mistress, Madame de Maintenon, and the place became very much about going to church all day long. And a lot of courtiers complained and said that this is not the Versailles we want parties. And so where did they go? They went to Philippe's house in Paris. So this kind of encapsulates what I'm trying to say, is that in a way, having a younger brother provides an alternate courtly space. In Britain, like I said, I'm not going to talk about Britain very much, but in Britain, it actually turned into two separate political spaces. So for example, during the reign of George II, his son, the Prince of Wales, had a completely separate political court called the Leicester House, set at Leicester, what's now Leicester Square. So sometimes it could be rival or even oppositional groups. But for the boys I'm looking at today, it's really just sort of an alternative way of patronizing art or music or politics, and focused on different buildings. So I think this is the research that I think is really interesting, that not just myself, but other people similar to me are doing research where we're realizing that monarchical systems or cultures aren't just about one person. It's not just the king. It's also the wife, the child, the brother, all kinds of people. So it's the totality that we're trying to look at. So we have this picture of the Palais Royal, although the clever eagle-eyed ones of you may have noticed that it's actually called the Palais Cardinal in this, because it was built by Cardinal Richelieu and then donated to the family when he died. So who are these people? On the left, we have Louis XIV, not the most famous portrait of him, but one of when he's at his young, virile, sexy phase, and his brother, painted about the same time, Philippe. They're only 2 years apart. They are very, very close from childhood onward, because there's no one else like them. And if you are born into a monarchy as powerful as the Bourbon dynasty in France, you're told from the moment you're born that no one else is like you. You are divinely appointed, except the person who shares exactly your blood. And so Louis and Philippe just had each other for their whole lives, really. And they were very, very close, but also very, very different. So Louis XIV is sort of rampantly heterosexual. Philippe is rampantly homosexual. But it never seemed to bother Louis XIV. He said, well, you know, my brother does what he does. I do what I do. We get along fine. And ironically, we're not going to go into the military side of the story here. One of the great ironies, you might say, of the story is that Philippe won several battles on the battlefield. Louis XIV never did. But Louis XIV was also very, very jealous of his pride. And so when Philippe came back from winning a battle, he was not celebrated. He was not given a Te Deum or a festival, and he wasn't given a command ever again. So don't overshadow your older brother, or you won't then ever get anything ever again. So that's this interesting rivalry we have between these two. The Sun King is Louis XIV. The younger brother in France is usually called the Duke of Orléans. That's the title that's usually, sort of like in this country, it's always the Duke of York. Okay, so this all comes, like I said, here's my plug for me. This book came out in 2021. I have to say I'm one of the few people I think who really benefited from a lockdown, because I had no excuse but just sit and write. And so I finished a book, and it came out then last year, and this year it won a prize from the Royal Studies Network, which I was very humbled and honored to receive. I've kept it thin as well, so if you're interested in purchasing it, it's only £40, which as an academic book, that's quite small. And it's about these second sons, and it does reach all the way until 1800. So the fourth younger brother is the one I'm not going to talk about today, and that's the younger brother of Louis XVI, who survives the revolution and actually becomes Louis XVIII in the 19th century. But I think his story is different enough that I'm not going to talk about him today. Of the four of them, I'm often asked, which one did you kind of fall in love with? And I think Philippe is the one that I've been studying the longest, but in fact, I really started to get to like Gaston d'Orléans better. And so I'll explain a little bit about who Gaston d'Orléans is now. So, but before we get to Gaston, there's one other precedent. I could go further and further back, of course, because kings have always had younger brothers. In the Middle Ages, the French kings came up with a good system of giving what's called an appanage to a younger brother. So a small territory that they could govern almost as an independent prince, but not quite independent. So this was the Duchy of Orléans or Anjou or Burgundy, or so these big, large provinces. The English monarchy did something similar with York and Lancaster. So hence the two rivals in the English Wars of the Roses. But sometimes you run out of appanages to give to younger brothers, and so they get a much smaller, less significant territory. So here is the case of François, the Duke of Alençon. Alençon is a fairly small duchy. It's part of Normandy, and he is the very youngest son of Catherine de' Medici and King Henry II. His relationship with both his brother and his mother, if you know anything about Catherine de' Medici, she loves her sons almost to death, except for some reason she despised François. She really just took against him, and all his life he was the unwanted black sheep of the family. It didn't help that he was very badly scarred by smallpox when he was a teenager, and so he was unattractive and apparently had a really bad personality. Nevertheless, he is at one point second in line to the throne. So his relationship is with his older brother, King Henry III of France. And so quite kind of skimming quickly through his political career, he's still quite young. He's only about 20 years old, and he becomes leader of a group of nobles called the Malcontents. You can guess maybe why they're called that. They were malcontent. They wanted more freedom. They wanted more power to the aristocracy. They didn't like the fact that the French king was trying to clamp down on independent nobles running around with their own private armies. And, you know, that seems sensible to us, but they didn't like it. So he leads this rebellion. It's repressed. It's put down. He then comes to England and decides to woo Elizabeth I. He's the one that she famously calls her frog, and comes actually quite close to marrying potentially him, even though he is 20 years younger than she. But that falls apart. And so he looks for another crusade, another cause, and goes and joins the Dutch revolt, helping the Protestant cause in the Netherlands against Spain, which seems a nice, honorable thing to do, except that his brother, the king, is trying desperately to keep peace with Spain. And if your brother then suddenly goes to the Netherlands and champions their enemies, I mean, their rebellion, it's not ever good. So everything he does is against his brother's will, is against his mother's will. There's always a flurry of letters back and forth saying, you need to come back to France. You really need to come back to France. He then catches a disease and dies. So his life is not very long. But before we leave his sort of precedent, recent studies have looked at him and said he's not all that bad, because his reputation has been so poor for the last 300 years that even in his short life, they're now starting to say, well, actually, he was emerging as quite a good patron. The very famous scholar Jean Baudin, who you may know as really one of the leading proponents of political theory of the 16th century, was for a time the private secretary of the Duke of Alençon. Claude Lejeune is one of the most famous composers of the late Valois 16th century court. And surprisingly, Nicholas Hilliard. And you think, well, what's he doing in France? He went to learn from the painters at the Valois court, but it's also thought he was a spy for Elizabeth I. And they had put him in the court of Elizabeth's friend and maybe fiance. So there's a really interesting patronage network that was growing up, but then he died. And so, of course, the network collapses. Okay, so fast forward then into the 17th century. The Valois dynasty became extinct in 1789. With no more male heirs, the throne passed through many generations of cousins to Henry IV, the first Bourbon king. Henry IV then had two sons. The eldest is Louis XIII, and the younger is Gaston, who is created Duke of Orléans in 1626. The trouble always between Gaston and his older brother Louis is that Louis XIII was quiet, shy, maybe a depressive. His chief interest was staying in a small room and reading a book, whereas the French needed King Henry IV back on the throne. He was the great champion, the great warrior, the great lover, the great gourmand, and that's what Gaston was as well. Gaston was his father's child. So they really liked the second son better, and that upsets the balance, really. So we have a whole series of noble revolts. Again, the nobility wanted their independent power. They didn't want the government to tell them what to do. The Chalais affair happens in 1626 when Gaston isn't even 20 years old. It's about who he's going to marry. Will he marry the king's choice or will he marry the noble's choice? They have a small rebellion, the rebellion is put down, and Gaston marries who he's told to marry. The Day of the Dupes comes about 4 years later when the king and their mother, the famous Maria de' Medici, have a big clash. She is duped because she thinks she's had a coup, but in fact it's the other way around. And Gaston and his mother flee the court, start a major civil war that lasts 2 years, but in the end that too is put down. The Cinq-Mars affair you might have heard about. It's actually turned into an opera, and there's some famous paintings of it, where more young, small, ambitious nobles try to take on the crown. Again, it goes disastrously wrong, and half of them lose their heads. The thing about Gaston d'Orléans is he can never really be punished, not just because he has royal blood and is the sibling of the king, but because Louis XIII doesn't have a child for 20 years of marriage. So Gaston's always the heir. So no matter what he does, you can't punish him. Finally, the year later in 1643, Louis XIII does die, but by that point he's had a child. Louis XIV becomes child king, age 5, and Gaston suddenly becomes the uncle rather than the brother. You've probably heard of the tropes, many stories, many Alexander Dumas novels about the wicked uncle looking after this baby nephew. Oops, the baby nephew gets snuffed out and dies. That's a recurring story in most monarchies around Europe. So there's always a worry about Gaston, who is both the chief protector, but maybe chief enemy of the young child, Louis XIV. So we have one more great rebellion, one more civil war called the Fronde of the Princes, which Gaston is kind of at the head of. But like with the previous one, he starts to turn his hand at doing other things. If he's constantly being told, you mustn't get involved in politics, you mustn't get involved in the military, Gaston says, okay, I'll do something else. So here we have a list of some writers. Tristan l'Hermite and Vincent Voiture are both writers quite prominent at the beginning of the 17th century. The second two, Jacques Vallée des Barreaux and Claude de Chauvigny de Blot, are not particularly famous to us, but if you study French literature of the 17th century, these guys are satirists. They're naughty poets. They write bawdy poetry. They were some of the ones who were trying to push back against the repressiveness of the growing absolutist regime. And so Gaston was their patron. So you can always see there's a bit of a play. If the monarchy is supporting the church, is supporting morality, the younger brother can be a bit more playful and support writers who are maybe a bit more independent-minded, maybe a bit smutty, we might say today. And so both Blot and des Barreaux are considered very good poets of the time, but also slightly risque. And Gaston's court is full of these guys. So where is he living? That's sort of where he makes a big splash. Feeling that he was definitely not wanted at court in Paris, he went off to the Loire Valley, where kings usually go, and he decided to settle in Blois, which was part of his appanage territory. But he didn't just want to live in the gorgeous Renaissance buildings that were already there. He really wanted to make his mark and almost create a new style. So on the left, you see what's called the Gaston d'Orléans wing of the Chateau of Blois. And as you see, it's a very different style. It's a very bold classicism. Neoclassical design isn't going to come into fashion until the reign of Louis XIV. So in a way, Gaston is preceding what his nephew will make famous. And then I included this other chateau here just to show you the difference of what was prevalent at the time and what's known as Louis XIII style. So you see quite a difference. Louis XIII style is a lot more late Gothic, whereas Gaston's style is this really bold classical style. And he finds this young man, a new architect that nobody had ever heard of, called François Mansart, and has him design and build his new wing at Blois. And if you know anything about architecture of France in the reign of Louis XIV, it's all Mansart. He becomes the main architect for Versailles, for example. So Gaston is, in a way, finding the talent that will then become famous in the next reign. Here's just a closer up picture of the Gaston wing. And his bust is over the door. So just a smattering of other things that he patronized. Here's where Moulinić comes in. Etienne Moulinić was his own personal composer. So he didn't compose for the king or Richelieu, he was Gaston's composer. And he wrote motets and litanies, and particularly a requiem mass, which was then used by French kings for the next century. He also sent people abroad to collect antiquities, like the one up on the top, and to collect things like the potato from South America or a tomato, and had a garden at Blois with all of these exotic plants. And then he commissioned one of the most famous botanical illustrators of the day to make these beautiful illustrations of plants and birds that people were learning about all around the world in the 17th century, from North America, from South Asia. At the end of his life, he donated these to the Natural History Museum in Paris, and they are still really the core of the collection there, as are his coins, the core of the collection of the National Museum of France in Paris. The last person I then want to mention, maybe for Gaston, is this young man who was touring with a troupe of artists and theatricals down in the south of France called Poquelin, who didn't yet have a patron. And he changed his name, and we know him as Molière. So the most famous playwright of the 17th century had been sort of discovered by Gaston down in the south of France, brought to Paris, and kind of set up as a famous playwright with his troupe. And one of the things I found interesting is that sometimes the patronage networks of these second sons pass from one to the other. So when Gaston died in 1660, young Philippe was just coming of age at about age 20, and Molière became Philippe's playwright. And Philippe is actually the godfather of one of Molière's sons. Philippe pays the bills for the troupe, and in fact, the troupe are installed in the Palais Royal. So still today, again, if you know Paris, you know there is still a theater there, and that's because Philippe built it. So here he is. Not quite the son, I think, is always the epithet that he might be given. And he had to, I think, be very, very careful to be sunshiny, but not too sunshiny. You never want to outshine your older brother if he is the King of France. So Philippe, I think, navigated this very well because he was by nature a much more flamboyant personality. So I mentioned already that he lived at the Palais Royal in Paris, but he was also gifted a large chateau in the suburbs. So just to the southwest of Paris, on a huge hill overlooking the River Seine, is Saint-Cloud, which he developed in the 1660s, just at the same time that Louis, his older brother, was developing Versailles. One of the things we often forget about if we're thinking about the reign of Louis XIV is that they didn't really move to Versailles until 1682, halfway through the reign. So the 1660s was just a building period, but Philippe got there first. And a lot of this building was finished before Versailles. And I'm going to show some images. I'll come back to that. Sorry, I'll skip to that. I'll stick with Saint-Cloud for now, and then I'll move back. this is a painting showing the whole landscape, and it's just glorious. I really wish we could go back in time because unfortunately it was blown up by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. So there's nothing at all left now, but you can see that it's this wonderfully positioned building overlooking the Seine Valley and these gardens everywhere. And the most famous thing, which attracted tourists from all around Europe, is called the Cascade. And that's just here, right in the center. Those of you at home, you can probably see my cursor there. And the Cascade, or the Grand Cascade, was something that tourists really did come. They came from Britain, they came from Germany to see this fantastic thing and promenade in the gardens. The other innovation at Saint-Cloud was the Galerie d'Apollon, or the Apollo Gallery, which was finished before something that you might, if you look at that photograph taken before 1870, recognize. It's the Hall of Mirrors. So he was there first, which I always like to remind people who love Louis XIV. The other thing that Monsieur was really passionate about was Chinese pottery. And he collected vast amounts of chinoiserie, and he created a special room at Saint-Cloud for different types of porcelain and different types of Chinese lacquerware and things. This is a reconstructed computer image, which someone recently has made, which I think is kind of cute. But the thing to highlight here is that it didn't become fashionable to decorate your home with Chinese lacquer or wallpaper for about 20 or 30 years. So again, Monsieur is doing this before anyone else. Right, so I'll go back to that in a minute, but I just wanted to highlight one other point that I bring out in the book is that one of the other useful things about a second son is not just patronizing music or art or science, but it's also people. So quite often, if you're an aristocrat and you're the eldest son, you go to Versailles, you get a job in the army or the church or the court. But if you're a second son, you're not as lucky. So one useful thing for second sons is that they can incorporate these second sons in their household. So these are some of the very famous people who went to work at the Palais Royal or at Saint-Cloud. Daniel de Cognac is his confessor, becomes a very powerful bishop. Boisfranc becomes the treasurer and then eventually the treasurer of France. So a lot of them actually use this post to catapult themselves to an actual national post. And then the next three, the Chevalier de Lorraine, the Marquis d'Effiat, and the Count of Beuvron, are all three very high nobles, but they're all second sons. So they wouldn't have necessarily had a place at court on their own, and they all live at Philippe's court for years and years and years. Same with Alexis de Chatillon. And these all come from the grandest families. You've probably heard of an Harcourt or a Chatillon or a Lorraine Guise. So this is, you might say it's a sort of an outlet for young aristocratic men who need a post at court, but aren't necessarily the eldest son. So this is then the Palais Royal again. And I said I'd mention another musician. You've probably heard of Lully. Jean-Baptiste Lully is Louis XIV's most famous composer. And he not only was the most famous composer, but he had a monopoly. The king said, no one can publish music unless Lully agrees. So this monopoly of power was really quite tyrannical. And Philippe, being the brother of the king, was one of the few people who seems to have been able to circumvent that. And so he had his own composer, Marc-Antoine Charpentier, who then became very famous in his own right. And that's purely by the protection of Philippe. And so he's set up here at the Palais Royal in one of the theaters. This is the, here. And Charpentier could write what he wanted. Again, I'm really interested in differences of style. So I'm not an architectural historian or a music historian, but Lully is also writing in a classical style. It's very formal, it's very rigid, whereas Charpentier had gone to Rome and was learning this new Italian style, which is much more openly romantic, much more emotional. something that the French thought was just too Italian, really. And so Charpentier is writing in this style with really overt emotions, which then become the norm for 18th century Baroque music writing. Lully is pushed aside as too staid, too stiff, and people like Charpentier become much more accepted. Here's the Palais Royal at the end of the life, again being redesigned by Ardouin Mansart, who is, of course, the nephew of the earlier Mansart. So these chains almost are happening of patronage from one generation to the next. And you may have heard of a mansard window, for example, up above on the top of your buildings. That's where the name comes from. Okay, so we've looked at Saint-Cloud. Before we leave France, then, I wanted to talk a little bit about this painting. Jean Nocret, again, is a painter that's probably not as famous as the other Versailles painters. So he was not approved of by the official formal Louis XIV painters. And just like Charpentier, Nocret went to Rome, learned a little bit more of an emotional style about painting, a lot more vibrant, a lot more colorful. And he was commissioned to paint this for Saint-Cloud. And it's enormous. The painting has survived, even if the palace hasn't. It's still in Versailles. And it depicts every member of the Bourbon dynasty as a different Olympian god. And so you can sort of go and look through and see who is who. And there's the Sun King is always Apollo. That's fairly well known. Louis XIV is the sun. His wife is Juno. His mother is sitting in the middle as Gaia. His cousins are the three Graces in the back. Philippe over here, I used to always think was just Poseidon, because that would make sense. But he's not really. And the Triton is actually being held by his mother-in-law, who is English. Well, she's French, but she's the Queen of England. That's Henrietta Maria. And Henrietta Anne from England is Flora. Yes. Oh, sorry, I thought that was a question. But it took me really some digging to figure out who Philippe is. And it turns out he's Phosphorus. And Phosphorus is the morning star. And so if you kind of follow the thought, he has his own illumination. He does light up the morning, but he's not as bright as the sun. So he is shiny, but just not as shiny as his brother. So the message of this painting, I think, is really, really good. He says, I am part of this family. I'm a really interesting, shiny part of it, but I'm not the sun. So I'm loyal to my older brother. It's a really good message, I think. Okay, so now I want to, in the last sort of 10 minutes or so, talk about other monarchs. England has its interesting share. Maybe that's the next slide. Yeah, so I'll get to that in a minute. England has a number of second sons who do become more famous than their older brothers. But in this century, it's good to start with James because he's the first cousin of Louis and Philippe. And because he grew up at the French court. After the execution of his father in 1649, he went to live with his mother in France. So he was raised at the French court and kind of saw how a second son should behave. I love this picture here of Charles and James in 1647, 2 years before Charles's execution. But early on, James took on a role which many second sons had done in England of being commander of the Navy. And by all accounts, including his own, because he left a good memoir of his own exploits, he was a good commander and he was a good soldier. And he fought in Europe with the French armies under the famous General Turenne. So he learned from the best. And then at the Restoration, he came back and became Lord High Admiral, in which he's painted here as a Roman general with the ships in the background. And people like Pepys or John Evelyn all say that James was a great organizer and a really great commander of the Navy in the 1670s. However, and we're not going to go much further into this, James turns out to be a very, very bad politician. As you probably know, he then becomes King James II in 1685, and within 3 years has alienated everyone in England and is pushed out in 1688 in the Glorious Revolution. So one thing he hadn't really learned, I think, was how to transition into power. The other thing I would say as a comparative, if I compare him to what the French princes are doing, is he hasn't really created an alternative space as younger brother. There's no famous palace that James has built. There's no separate composers, separate artists. I might just not know about them. So this is a new area of research that I would like to start to do a bit more comparatively to see what James was thinking of doing if his older brother, Charles II, had lived longer. So let's go back a little bit and see other examples, because there are actually quite a lot. If we go all the way back, maybe John of Gaunt is a much more powerful third son, and gradually overthrows his nephew, Richard II, or pushes that direction, and Henry Bolingbroke steps in to actually do the deed to become King Henry IV. I don't know how well you all know your 15th century English history, but that we'll not go much further into that. More famous, I suppose, than that, of course, is Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the very, very powerful younger brother of Edward IV, who ruled the North really almost as an independent lord, and then became Richard III. But he too, I think, had alienated the political classes. The Wars of the Roses come to a crashing end at Bosworth, and he is killed and then discovered in a parking lot. And then the last two on this list, you may not know, but both Henry VIII and Charles I were second sons. They were both Duke of York, and were not expected to become the monarch. Henry's older brother, Arthur, died as a young man, so Henry moved into the next position. Charles's older brother, Henry, Prince of Wales, was expected to be the great savior. He was meant to be the best king England was ever going to have, and then he died as a teenager. So we get Charles I, who was not great. And Prince William, Duke of Cumberland. I wanted to bring us into the 18th century a little bit to connect us now to Prussia. As this research project goes forward, I think this is the one that I want to focus on more if I start to study British history, because I don't think he's ever really been studied as a member of the court. He's famous, of course, as a general. He is the younger brother of George II, and he is the great victor on the continent, first in Flanders and in Germany, but then more famously at Culloden. So the final expression of Scottish independence, really, 1745, is crushed by the Duke of Cumberland. He's looking here quite bold and quite, not dashing is the wrong word, but I think he has a lot more presence here than his older brother ever had. Cumberland Lodge is where he lived outside of Windsor, and is still a residence that's sometimes given out to extended members of the current royal family. Okay, so the last person that I want to really look at is Prince Henry of Prussia, who I find really quite fascinating. He's several years younger than his brother Frederick the Great, and many people who are military tacticians of the 18th century have said that he is equal, if not better, than his older brother. So military historians of the 18th century will say Frederick the Great is one of the most ingenious tacticians of the age, but Henry was meant to be even better. And what has survived over the years, and I read this book last Christmas about their letters, the two, Frederick and Henry, write to each other all the time. And they're the most amazing letters because one of them is full of just complete love and adoration between the two brothers. And then the next set are just absolute loathing. And they really hate each other at some points. And Henry is constantly frustrated because at the height of any war, so the Austrian succession, the 7 Years' War is probably the most famous. Anytime Henry thinks, right, we can win this war if we just do this. And Frederick says, well, I don't really want you to get the glory. So it's again, this same rivalry. So Henry does what our French princes did. He retreats from politics. He leaves Berlin. He says, Frederick, you do that, and I will stay here. Sorry. That's just telling me to stop. And so Henry, or Heinrich, if you want to, give him his proper name, moves out to the countryside. He inherits a castle on a lake called Rheinsberg and really develops it into a center of art, philosophy, music, and it becomes the center of a kind of a Prussian Renaissance in the middle of the 18th century. And a lot of people start abandoning the court in Berlin because they would much rather be with Henry. And you can imagine Frederick the Great doesn't like that. They probably got tired of Frederick's flute playing. So here is Henry as an older man. He outlives his brother by quite some time. He is married, but he never has children. So the throne does pass to a nephew. The one thing that I learned about when I was reading about this is that he remains a military figure for the rest of his life. And he builds this grand obelisk at his country retreat at Rheinsberg for the heroes of the 7 Years' War. So he commemorates all of his loyal generals and colonels and commanders and soldiers. But the one name that is not on that obelisk is Frederick the Great. And so he makes it really clear that he thinks his brother doesn't deserve this position of honor. So even late in life, there's still a slight rivalry. Okay, I promised that was the last one. There is one more, because we always have to mention the Habsburgs in a talk. They're my first love, really, and I always bring them in. This is one of my favorite paintings. This is the Emperor Joseph II with his younger brother Leopold. And one advantage that the Habsburgs have over, say, the Stuarts or the Bourbons is that they have other territories that they can give younger brothers to rule as independent princes. So just by luck, really, Tuscany became available. And so Leopold, who took on the name Pietro Leopoldo, goes down and rules in Florence for 20 years before his brother dies, and he then becomes the emperor himself. So this is the future Leopold II. But what he's done is he redecorates a lot of the interiors of the Medici palaces, but most famously the Villa del Poggio Imperiale outside of Florence. And so here he's actually depicted himself being greeted by Minerva, who is presenting the Tuscan people to him. And remarkably, he's one of the most enlightened people of an enlightened era. And he sees that the Florentine state has been in chaos for 100 years. And he really actually does quite a good job at regulating taxes and laws and things like that. So there are good things for second sons to do in Italy. Okay, so this is the last slide finally. I knew I couldn't give this talk without bringing it really up to the present to say, are we still having second sons? And yes, of course we are. And you'll notice that I have chosen to stick with the military in nice, safe, and also young pictures. So neither of them have entered their sort of scandalous phase. I will leave it, I think, to future historians to look at these second sons in their totality. But the point that I wanted to make really here was that there is still always a role for a second son to play in a modern monarchy as an alternative space or an alternative career activity. So Andrew in the Falkland War in 1981 on one side, and Harry in Afghanistan in 2013, keeping the monarchy in close touch, really, with the military. And this is a tradition that goes back 1,000 years. Monarchy and military are always hand in hand. So I will wrap up with that and leave these guys on the screen, I suppose. And yeah, so that's what I wanted to present to you today, is this idea of where second sons fit in the history of monarchies.